It was around 8 p.m. on the 19th of April 2003 when a motorist saw flames emanating from woodland near a bird sanctuary in Sussex, England. He immediately called for the fire brigade, who arrived on scene in just a matter of minutes. As they extinguished the flames, it quickly became apparent that this wasn't just a fire. Brighton and Hove is lovingly dubbed London by the Sea due to its cosmopolitan nature. It's the only town in Britain to have a Grade 1 listed pier, and it's a desirable area for those who want the best of modern British culture and city life. It's a very diverse city, and it's easy to mingle with the local community, offering a vibrant, yet chilled and safe environment. 31-year-old Jane Longhurst lived in a ground-floor apartment on Shaftesbury Road in Brighton with her long-term partner, Malcolm Sentance. Jane had been drawn to the area after growing up in Reading. She was the daughter of Bill and Liz, and she had an older sister named Sue. Growing up, Jane had attended George Palmer Infant School before being enrolled at Maiden Early Comprehensive School. She was described by her mother as a very lovely, happy child, who then blossomed into a beautiful soul and somebody who was easy to love. Jane had always had a passion for music, even learning how to play the violin at just 5 years old. It was this love for music that spurred Jane on to attend Liverpool University, where she obtained a degree before attending the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. It was during her postgraduate studies at Sussex University that she met Malcolm. In the mid-1990s, Jane moved to Brighton, where she got a spot on the local orchestra, playing the violin. Once settled, she started teaching English and music at Upland School in Brighton, which was a school for children with learning and behavioural difficulties. The head teacher, Paul Atkins, fondly recalled, "Jane is highly respected, very well liked and extremely conscientious. She's the type of teacher who doesn't take time off sick, who runs after school clubs, and is always full of bright new ideas. She is dedicated to the school." Jane was devoted to her students and to her music, with her friend Cynthia Errott commenting, "Jane is very happy and a popular member, very lively and attractive. Jane never missed a concert or a rehearsal. She is a very positive, confident, and dedicated person and musician." Jane and Malcolm had been in a loving relationship for 4 years. And while they loved Brighton, they had chatted about relocating to Bath. Jane and Malcolm enjoyed a good work-life balance, with each going to their respective jobs each morning, and then spending evenings and weekends together. On the morning of Friday, the 4th of March 2003, Jane left her home in Brighton, carrying her purse and mobile phone. Her partner Malcolm had gone to work as an educational welfare officer at around 6:45 a.m. that morning. He kissed Jane goodbye and left their shared apartment. He recollected, she always had Fridays off and never wasted the day by lounging around. She would get up early, plan her schoolwork, tidy the flat, play her viola, or go to the gym. That morning, Jane did the grocery shopping, listened to music, and then worked on her computer for some time. She then called up a friend that she and Malcolm both knew from the orchestra, where they both played. The friend later recollected that Jane seemed absolutely normal and cheerful, very upbeat during their conversation. They said that they would see each other at rehearsals on Sunday before ending the phone call. At around 10 a.m, Jane sends a text message to a work colleague, asking about getting some paint for the apartment. She then called a friend, Lisa, to see how she was feeling after she had been struggling with morning sickness. Lisa wasn't home. At some stage during the day, Jane's phone was switched off, and it was never turned on again. That evening, Malcolm returned home to find the apartment eerily dark and silent. He had expected Jane to be making the dinner, but Jane was nowhere to be seen. Malcolm attempted to phone Jane, but her phone just went straight to voicemail. Malcolm then decided to contact Jane's mother, Liz, assuming that she had popped over and lost track of time. Liz told Malcolm that she and Jane had plans for that afternoon to visit an exhibition in London, but Liz wasn't feeling too well, so she decided to postpone the trip. Liz hadn't heard from Jane either, but suggested to Malcolm that she was at the local youth centre. Jane was a familiar face at the youth centre where she volunteered. She was a gifted classical musician and a dedicated educator who always took on extra roles to share her love of music. Malcolm arrived at the youth centre, but Jane wasn't there. He became increasingly concerned for Jane's welfare. It wasn't like Jane to just up and vanish without letting anybody know where she was going. He called around a number of her friends only to learn that nobody had heard from Jane. It quickly dawned on Malcolm that Jane was missing. When she failed to return home by midnight, he called the police. Initially, Jane's disappearance was treated as an ordinary missing person inquiry. Police simply assumed that Jane and Malcolm had an argument, and Jane had left to gather her thoughts. She would be home soon, they surmised. But the hours quickly transformed into days, and Jane failed to return home. The inquiry heightened, and police began to conduct door-to-door interviews. They handed the occupant a photograph of Jane and provided details of her disappearance, hoping that somebody could provide further insight. Nobody could. Police also conducted routine interviews with all of Jane's nearest and dearest, but none of them had any clue where she could have been. Following initial interviews, the case was handed over to the Criminal Investigation Department. Police had established that Jane was a stable, kind-hearted, and financially steady woman. She was in a happy relationship and had a successful career. So for her to be missing for over 48 hours with no trace, friends and police alike had begun to fear the worst. Over the weekend, Jane had been scheduled to teach classes and attend a church concert where she would have been playing the viola. Jane would never have missed it for the world. She was a reliable woman, especially when it came to her career and church. But Jane was a no-show. This only enhanced the fear of her loved ones, who now wholeheartedly believed that something sinister had transpired. Her mother Liz commented, "I am extremely worried. I just cannot think what could have happened. I just want her to call us and let us know she is safe." Malcolm, Liz, and Jane's older sister Sue had been calling Jane's mobile phone persistently since she vanished. Forensic experts were called into the couple's home to search for any evidence that could lead them to Jane. The search was unfruitful. By all appearances, Jane had left her home at some point during the day, safe and well, and then just never returned. In an attempt to generate some leads, police began to scour local CCTV to try and trace Jane's last known movements. The public were asked to keep an eye out for Jane, who was described as being white with short brown hair and standing at around 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighing around 140 pounds. Jane's family made tearful pleas for information. Her sister Sue pleaded, "Where are you? We miss you. The hardest part is simply not knowing what has happened, which is where we need the help of both the public and the media. As time goes by, we are finding it increasingly hard to cope." Malcolm feared that Jane had been abducted. He was adamant that she wouldn't travel anywhere without informing someone. He stated, "It's a real mystery. She is a very dependable, reliable person, just a normal run-of-the-mill professional, happy working woman. We hadn't had an argument. We don't really row. Like any other couples, we disagree, but nothing big. It's very distressing and extremely strange." 4 days after Jane was reported missing, police launched Operation Keen. 45 officers were brought in to expand the search, and further door-to-door inquiries were carried out. Gardens were combed for evidence, but hours and hours of CCTV footage was reviewed. It was a massive resource stretch for the investigative team, but they were determined to find Jane. In a bid to generate some much-needed tips, a massive media appeal was launched. Jane's loved ones all pleaded on national television for Jane to come home, or for information that could lead them to Jane. Following the appeal, the public reported sightings of Jane from all across the United Kingdom, in Southampton, Brighton and Wales. Over a week passed, but none of the leads turned out to be tangible. Police began to question whether this was a missing persons case or an abduction and murder case. By day 12 of the search, police had begun to fear the worst. They'd been unable to find any surveillance of Jane leaving Brighton, and her phone had remained switched off since the day she vanished. DCI's Steve Dennis was heading Operation Keen, and he publicly stated that the case simply made no sense. He stated, "We are keeping an open mind. However, as time goes on, we are naturally becoming increasingly concerned for Jane's safety." Jane's family frequently spoke about their missing loved one, hoping to keep the disappearance in the forefront of everyone's minds. Her mother stated, "We are in limbo, and it's horrible. All we can do is take each day as it comes. I try to block out the thoughts of what might have happened. We've got to be positive for Jane's sake, because we simply do not know what has happened. The thought of one of my children disappearing has always given me the horrors, but I thought it was something that happens to other people. I wouldn't wish it on anybody."
I also want to appeal to anyone else who might know of my daughter's whereabouts or who knows anything about her disappearance.
Liz went on to speak publicly about the last time she spoke to her daughter, 2 days before she inexplicably vanished. Jane had called her mother on the way to school that morning, but Liz said there was nothing on the phone call that stood out in her mind. She stated, it probably ended with her saying, "I've got to run." She was always so busy. I would have said, "Have a good day," or something fairly trite. Liz further commented in the media that she was glad that Jane's father had passed away, because it meant he would not have to experience the wave of pain and uncertainty that came with a missing child. Mother's Day came and went, and Jane's absence further compounded her fears that Jane wasn't coming home. DCI Dennis commented, "This is totally out of character, and if Jane could have got to a phone to speak with her mum on this special day, then she would, no matter where she is. The fact that Jane did not call her mum on Mother's Day, coupled with all of the other lines of inquiry we have followed up in the past 2 weeks, suggests Jane has not gone anywhere out of choice. We believe that she has been abducted and probably killed. As such, this is now a major crime inquiry." After almost 3 weeks with no developments, police began to truly believe that Jane had been the victim of foul play. In a bid to find Jane's body, they spanned out across woodland surrounding Brighton. For the next 2 weeks, their searches were unfruitful. Police were struggling to find any evidence of what happened to Jane, or even a person of interest who may have wished to bring her harm. Over 100 officers were working on the mysterious case, with 9 detectives following up on intelligence reports. As with every missing person inquiry, those closest to Jane fell under a cloud of suspicion. This included Malcolm and Jane's music teacher. Malcolm's computer was seized to be analysed, and he gave voluntary DNA samples. He stated, "The police need a lead, and they have chosen to start at the flat. That is all right because they have to do their job, but it's very stressful. I think they are looking for spots of blood, signs of a struggle, or DNA from any known criminals." Both were quickly ruled out, however, leaving police back at square one. Police then turned their attention to Jane's phone records, hoping that they could provide a clue. They revealed that the last phone call Jane had made was at 10:05 a.m. to her friend Lisa Stevens' home. Lisa had been struggling with morning sickness, and Jane wanted to check in on her. Lisa wasn't home, but her partner, Graham Coots, told police that he had picked up the phone. He said that he chatted with Jane for several minutes about Lisa's pregnancy. The weeks continued to drag on for Jane's family, and on the 10th of April they made another appeal for information. Liz stated, "We are increasingly worried. We are expecting the worst and want to know what has happened, no matter how hard it is to accept. We want the nightmare to come to an end." In a bid to generate some much-needed information, a £5,000 reward was put forward by Sussex Police. Second in command of Operation Keene, Detective Inspector Chris Standard stated, "The investigation team is becoming increasingly frustrated by the lack of information. Since Jane went missing 4 weeks ago, officers have worked tirelessly and around the clock to try and find her. The information has certainly confirmed that Jane had no intention of leaving of her own choice. We think something serious has happened to Jane, and that she has been killed." The thought that Jane had been killed was a massive blow to her family, but they desperately wanted to know either way. They'd always believed that Jane hadn't simply ran away on her own volition. On Saturday, the 19th of April, almost 5 weeks after Jane was reported missing, Daniel Fowler reported a fire near an RSPB nature reserve at Wiganholt Common, near Pulborough. It was around 20 miles away from Brighton.
It's down a country road. I've just gone past in my car and the forest is on fire.
Daniel observed the flames for a couple of seconds, before noticing that they appeared to be a strange colour. He called 999 to report the inferno. The fire brigade arrived within minutes. Daniel watched on as the flames were extinguished. He then turned to leave, but was flagged down by a police officer who informed him that it wasn't just a fire, but instead a body burning. Upon the gruesome discovery, detectives working on Jane's disappearance were called to the scene. The woman's body was laid upon blue tarpaulin and cardboard that was imprinted with the Cleanese logo. A box marked fragile was on top of the woman's head, and her face was concealed with a green scarf. Evidence showed that the woman's body had been doused with petrol and then set alight in an area that was neither secluded or well hidden. DCI Steve Dennis stated, "It's bizarre. It must have been an urgent gut reaction, that whoever it was had to get rid of her body. It was a panic-type situation. This type of bizarre behaviour ought to have caused someone's suspicion. And for the family's sake, I am asking you to come forward." A post-mortem was carried out the following day. The victim was identified via dental records as Jane Longhurst. Dr. Vesna Drovic carried out the exam. She found that a pair of women's tights had been wrapped around Jane's neck, tightly as a ligature. She determined that Jane had been strangled to death. The level of decomposition suggested that Jane had been dead for around 4 or 5 weeks, but there was no evidence of predation or maggot infestation. It suggested that Jane's body had been stored away somewhere cool and somewhere away from flies. Jane's clothing, mobile phone and purse were still unaccounted for. The missing person investigation had now transformed into a murder investigation.
No one can prepare you for something so terrible. To lose a loved one in such a way cannot ever be imagined, and we would not wish what we are going through on anyone.
We have lost someone who was very loved and so special. Please, if you think you know something, then find in your conscience to call the police.
Police immediately wanted to re-interview those who knew Jane and those who were among the last to speak to her. This included Lisa's friend's partner, Graham Coates, who'd spoken to Jane just before she disappeared. Police spoke with Graham at his home, and while here they noticed that there was a stack of cardboard boxes that were stamped with the word fragile. Graham Coates was then asked to come to the police headquarters to be formally interviewed on the 24th of April.
When did you last see Jane Longhurst?
It was the Sunday before, when they both came over.
And the last time you spoke to Jane was the phone call?
The phone call on the Friday, yeah.
He was asked by police to account for his whereabouts on the day that Jane disappeared and the day her body was discovered. Coates told police that on the day Jane vanished, he'd been out delivering products for the company he worked part-time for, Cleanese. As for the day Jane's body was found, he said he had spent the day shopping for baby things with his pregnant partner Lisa. Coates couldn't provide any proof that he'd been making deliveries on the day that Jane disappeared, nor could he provide proof that he was shopping with his partner on the day her body was found. Throughout the interview, Coates appeared to be overly nervous. He refused to give clear answers and frequently requested to use the bathroom. He told police that his relationship with Jane was nothing more than friends.
How would you describe your relationship with Jane?
Friends?
Anything more?
No.
She was more his partner's friend than his friend, he said. He denied any involvement in Jane's murder, but police were suspicious. That afternoon, Graham Coates was arrested on suspicion of murder. The following day, the arrest was announced during a press conference. Liz and Sue spoke of their ordeal, while Malcolm provided a statement to be read aloud. It read in part, "I am missing Jane every hour of every day and night that passes. It's heartbreaking when your life turns a corner and new experiences occur, and the one person you want to share them with is not there. Jane will always be a very special friend to me. She was loving, warm, beautiful, a fantastic musician and teacher, a great laugh, my best mate, and I would have happily spent the rest of my life with her. She would always say, 'Malk, do you want to get married at some point?' And I'd reply, 'Yeah, maybe, whenever.' She was always open about her feelings. She enjoyed the challenge of teaching children and would have loved to have some of her own. We were going to buy a house, travel. We had so many plans for the future. For 5 weeks I was praying she would be found alive and that we could meet again. With Graham Coots behind bars, his car was searched. There was a distinct smell of decomposition emanating from the trunk of the car. Despite the smell, there was nothing inside the trunk, and no concrete evidence connecting Coots to the murder of Jane. He contended that he wasn't involved, and with a lack of evidence, Coots was released on bail. 3 days later, a phone call came into police from staff at Big Yellow Self-Storage. The warehouse was located on Coombe Road in Brighton. Staff had become aware of a foul odour emanating from a container that they had assumed was dead pigeons. The container had been rented by a man who identified himself as Paul Kelly on the 25th of March. The caller was concerned about wasting police time, but the smell had dissipated after Jane's body had been found, and they were concerned that the two things could have been linked. Police were dispatched to the Big Yellow storage warehouse, and they reviewed CCTV footage of the man who identified himself as Paul Kelly. It was Graham Coots. He had first used the ground floor unit C50 on the 25th of March. Between then and the 18th of April, he had visited the unit 7 times. On the 18th of April, he was spotted on CCTV entering the warehouse at 6:45 p.m. He was bringing a trolley into the elevator to his unit. Almost 20 minutes later, he emerged with a large box on the trolley that he then wheeled to his car. Coots then went back inside and looked at the floor before retrieving some toilet paper from the bathroom, which he then used to wipe the floor. Police speculated that he was wiping up bodily fluid that had leaked from the box. Police obtained the set of keys for the unit, and inside they found Jane's clothing, mobile phone, and purse. They additionally found a blood-stained t-shirt, a blood-stained rope, a blood-stained cleanees box, a used condom, a green petrol can, matches and gloves. Graham Coots was rearrested the following day and he was charged with the murder of Jane Longhurst. When re-interviewed, he had very little to say, other than he didn't know if he had strangled Jane. Coots' computer was seized, and it contained thousands of images of violent pornography, including images of women being strangled and necrophilia. The grim pornography had been downloaded both before and after Jane was killed. The bloodstained t-shirt was forensically examined. The DNA came back as a match to Jane. The t-shirt was also stained with semen, which came back as a match to Coots. Investigating further, police uncovered CCTV footage from the Texaco garage in Kingsway in Hove. The CCTV footage showed Coots purchasing a petrol can, toilet roll and black tape on the 19th of April at around 7:40 p.m. Less than an hour before Jane's body was set alight. Coates continued to deny any involvement in Jane's murder, until 6 months later, when he made the startling claim that Jane had died during a consensual act of erotic asphyxia. He claimed that Jane wanted him to choke her. According to Coates, after Jane called looking for Lisa, he asked her if she wanted to go swimming with him. Jane accepted the offer and packed her swimming togs and towel and was picked up by Coates. He claimed that Jane had become upset over something in the car, and they decided to go to his flat instead for a cup of tea. He said that while he was comforting her, they began kissing, and that eventually led them into the bedroom. He said he undressed Jane, but said that he kept his t-shirt on because he was conscious of his weight. After putting on a condom, he said that he was unable to maintain an erection, and they engaged in sexual acts before Jane placed his hand on her neck. He claimed that it was at this point that he suggested they use the tights. While Coates was laying back masturbating, he said that Jane was kneeling next to him with some tights around her neck. Coates said that he pulled on the tights, and as he ejaculated, he closed his eyes. He said that when he reopened them, Jane was splayed out across him, lifeless. Coates told the police that he panicked and tried to cover it up, afraid that by calling 999 and having police come to the scene, his pregnant partner, Lisa, may have a miscarriage. Instead of calling for help, Coates said he cleaned up the flat, removed the blood from the bed, and then purchased a tarpaulin. He first of all moved Jane's body to the trunk of his car, and then to the shed after he was questioned by police about Jane's disappearance. In March, he said he panicked and moved the body to the storage unit. Coates explained to police that he had a long-term fixation with breath control play and had engaged in it with several partners. At one point, he had spoken with his GP about his obsession. He spoke about how the fetish went from being something he was curious about to something he was concerned about, and eventually, something he was comfortable with. He didn't believe that it had any connection with violence, and claimed it didn't go as far as wanting to strangle women to death. Many of his ex-partners later testified that he had always had a strangulation fetish. Jane was finally laid to rest on the 10th of June 2003. Over 300 people shuffled into the Church of St. Peter in Brighton to say their final goodbyes to the teacher and musician who was loved by many. The dreary weather matched the sombre mood of the funeral. Her wicker casket was shadowed by her mother, sister, nephew and Malcolm, who had written a eulogy which read, "I spent 4 brilliant years with Jane, and I felt privileged to have known her and her excellent family. I am heartbroken at the untimely loss of a truly great friend, someone who I felt a real love for, someone whose company I never tired of, someone who was simply great fun to be with. I'm sure Jane misses you as much as you miss her. It's simply a great tragedy that Jane never had her own children. It was something she spoke of often, and I know she would have made a brilliant mother. I will forever miss her laughter, friendship and love." Tributes were also paid by the head teacher of the school where Jane worked, Paul Atkins. Jane's death was a tragedy, but I ask you not to dwell on this. I want to focus on her life and the impact she had on so many people. Look around and you'll see how many have come to pay their respects. You're here because you want to say your farewell to Jane and share the grief. Jane touched every one of our lives. Let us thank God for being able to say, I had the privilege of knowing Jane in person. As the casket was carried from the church to go to a private service at the crematorium, the mourners sang the hymn, "All Things Bright and Beautiful." Many were too overcome with emotion to carry on singing. As the congregation left the church, the rain had stopped and the sun shone down. Graham Coates continued to deny that he had purposefully killed Jane. He was ordered to stand trial the following January. During opening statements, prosecutor Kelsey Fry said, "We allege it was on March 14 that this defendant murdered 31-year-old schoolteacher Jane Longhurst by strangling her to death in satisfying his bizarre and macabre sexual fantasy. The Crown alleges that having killed her and had his way with her, he did not dispose of her body but kept her somewhere known only to him for 11 days before moving her to a storage unit, hired in a false name. He kept the body for almost a month, visiting it every 3 or 4 days. Until the smell became pungent, it began to attract attention. The defendant then removed the body, took it to a secluded spot in the woods, poured petrol upon it, and set the remains on fire. He went on to describe the knot in the tights found wrapped around Jane's neck, stating, "Although the knot was tied simply, it seems that it was nevertheless effective, given that over a month after Jane Longhurst went missing, the ligature was still sufficiently tight to be causing indentation marks on the neck." It was the prosecution's case that Coates had deliberately murdered Jane to satisfy his own sexual desires. They believed that the murder was the culmination of years of escalating fantasies involving strangling his sexual partners. As for the defence, they held on to the view that Jane's death had been a freak accident that occurred during consensual sex. At the trial, Coates alleged that he didn't tell police the truth during his initial interviews because he was afraid of putting Lisa's pregnancy at risk. During the trial, forensic evidence from inside the storage unit was presented. This included the condom containing Coates' semen and Jane's DNA, which was found on the outside. It also included the blood-stained t-shirt which contained both Coates' DNA and Jane's DNA. The manager at the storage unit testified that they had sold Coates a large cardboard box on the 9th of April, and then on the 15th of April, a strong odour began to emanate from his unit. Dr. Richard Shepherd testified for the defence. He said that he agreed that Jane's cause of death was caused by compression of the neck, but he didn't agree about the exact way the asphyxiation occurred. Dr. Vesna Dvorak, who had performed the autopsy, told the jury that there were 3 types of death caused by strangulation. The first type was vascular strangulation, which is caused by an obstruction of the arteries in the neck. The supply of oxygenated blood to the brain and return of blood to the heart is cut off, resulting in the person falling unconscious within seconds. Death can result within 2 to 3 minutes. The second type was respiratory strangulation, which is the obstruction of the airways by compression of the windpipe. This prevents air from entering the lungs and oxygenating the blood. The outcome is death within the same time frame, but this type of strangulation allows the victim to struggle. The third type was vagal inhibition, which is caused by the compression of nerve endings in the neck, which can send signals to slow the victim's heart rate. This type of strangulation leads to a quick death, and minimal signs of asphyxiation or strangulation marks. Dr. Jarovic found no damage to Jane's voice box or spine. She said the bleeding from the mouth and nose was to be expected and explained the blood to Coates' t-shirt. She then concluded that Jane's death was most likely vascular or respiratory strangulation due to the level of blood found on Coates' t-shirt. As for Dr. Shepherd, he concluded that Jane's death was caused by vagal inhibition, which was caused when the ligature was tightened on the receptors in Jane's neck. This would have caused heart arrhythmia, which would have eventually slowed to a stop. A model of the ligature used to strangle Jane was presented as evidence by a forensic expert. He explained that a pair of tights had been tied in a half knot, enabling Coates to tighten the ligature by pulling with force. He thought the ligature could have been loosened when Coates stopped gripping the tights. The knot had been tied while Jane was facing Coates, but there was no indication it was consensual. The prosecution then called on computer experts to give evidence about the items found on Coates' computer. Records showed he had visited a number of pornographic websites, at times that were close to the crime. He had searched for the terms rape, murder, and necro, and the expert testified that the material on his computer showed that the women appeared to be more like victims than willing participants. The day before Jane was killed, Coates had been on a website titled Death by Asphyxia. He remained on the website for close to 2 hours. Coates claimed he did not recall visiting such websites and stated, "There's nothing sexual about a dead body. Nothing. And the smell was getting worse and worse and worse. There's nothing remotely sexual about that." During trial, Coates stuck to his story that it was a consensual sex act that resulted in Jane's death, and that he had simply panicked when she collapsed. The jury were then sent off to deliberate. They deliberated for over 9 hours before finding Graham Coates guilty of Jane Longhurst's murder. Judge Richard Brown sentenced him to 30 years in prison. In handing down the sentence, he said, "In seeking perverted sexual gratification by way of your sordid and evil fantasies, you have taken her life and devastated the lives of those she loved and those who loved her. Everything that this court has heard about Jane Longhurst shows her to have been the sort of person whose life enriched all of those who came into contact with her. Her undoubted love of her partner, her music and her life screamed out of every page of the evidence I have heard in this case. By persisting in your denials, you have put those loved ones through the ordeal of this courtroom and have forced them to relive the last moments of her life and the unbelievable degradation of her body. You have shown not one jot of remorse." Coates would appeal his sentence and conviction, and in 2005 he won an appeal for a retrial. One ground of appeal was the failure to provide credit to Coates. He had been remanded in custody for 10 months, and those 10 months were not deduced from his prison sentence. In 2007, Coates stood trial again, and the outcome was the same. He was convicted once more of Jane's murder. This time, however, his minimum sentence was dropped from 30 years to 26 years. In the wake of the trial, Liz campaigned strongly to ban violent pornography. Over 50,000 signatures were collected, and the aim was for it to be a criminal offence to possess images depicting violent pornography. In 2009, a new law banning extreme pornography was introduced into the Criminal Justice Bill. The new law defines violent pornography as an act which threatens or appears to threaten a person's life, an act which results in or appears to result in serious injury to a person's anus, breasts, or genitals, an act which involves or appears to involve sexual interference with a human corpse, a person performing or appearing to perform an act of intercourse or oral sex with an animal. For years, Graham Coates had been displaying an obsession with violent pornography, predominantly the strangulation of women. While he had once sought out help for such an obsession, he eventually decided that it was nothing to worry about. In the end, his deadly obsession cost Jane Longhurst her life. Well, besties, that is it for this episode of Morbidology. As always, a massive, massive thank you for listening. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to my newest Patreon supporters, JT Jesse, Brad and Steve. Your support seriously goes such a long way. I'd also like to thank Eileen McFarlane from Crime Labs and The Shattered Window for her research and writing of this episode. If you're looking for a new true crime podcast to binge, go and check out Crime Labs and The Shattered Window if you haven't listened already. If you'd like to support the show, you can join Morbidology on Patreon for as little